Kim Jong-un of North Korea, who is obviously a madman who doesn't mind starving or killing his people, will be tested like never before. To my panel, Rebecca, IRIS Independent Research President and former official for the Secretary of the Air Force, Harry Kazanis, Director of the Center for National Interest Defense Studies, and Ned Ryan, American Majority CEO. Let me start with you, Harry, because it feels like eventually the war of words becomes an actual war, and we're moving at such an exponentially rapid pace, it feels like it could be imminent.
You know, Charles, I never thought I'd say this, but there does feel like an air of war that's in the air. I mean, I never thought I'd hear the day when the North Koreans would actually be offering up that they would be testing an atmospheric nuclear weapon in the Pacific. The amount of fallout and radioactive dust that could be thrown around, it would really be catastrophic. And keep in mind, the North Koreans might not actually go with an atmospheric test. They could actually be bluffing like they did with alleging that they were going to fire a missile near Guam. They could test an ICBM and maybe drop it, say, 200, 300 miles off the coast of California. So there's a range of things the North Koreans could do here.
Rebecca, last week you were on a show and there was a communique out of North Korea, and you interpreted it as them blinking, as perhaps maybe trying to find a way out of this thing. Certainly they're not doing that anymore. You know, the belligerence has ratcheted up to an entirely new level.
Well, they sure sound belligerent, but they're going to have to find a way out at some point. You know, what Rocket Man understands is that if he does a hydrogen bomb launch, a missile launch, anything that, as Mattis says, threatens us or our allies, you know, we're going to take military action. So he knows those military options are on the table. That is why he's wriggling and squirming so hard right now.
But
the pressure is getting to him.
With all due respect, Rebecca, you know, we've made these threats to him, and he's always answered them with an even greater response, an even greater level of provocation.
Right now it's words. What I think he's really responding to is those powerful economic sanctions. That financial sanction is going to hurt him for the first time and hurt his ability to give favors to his cronies. That's what he's really responding to here.
Ned, listen, I understand that cutting off these economic ties ultimately should have put some pressure on Kim Jong-un, but we know he's got billions of dollars squirreled away in Switzerland. He's got billions of dollars in other funds, and he also has a black market economy. What's going to happen if he does continue these actions?
Well, I will say this. I thought what was very interesting yesterday was, again, with Trump's executive order and China's almost immediate response. Obviously, it was due to diplomacy, behind-the-scenes diplomacy that obviously been in the works for weeks, if not months, in which the Bank of China and other economic institutions of China agreed they were going to cut off North Korea. My biggest thing, Charles, in all of this, if you really want to see this resolved in a quick fashion, we make our interest China's interest, and China understands then that they're going to have to cut off North Korea's oil supply. Again, over 90% of North Korea's oil comes from China. You want to see this thing come to a grinding halt in a matter of just a few months. China cuts off North Korea's oil.
Okay, I got
At the same time,
Ned, are you saying are you saying that we go through and completely cut off trade with China as a way of them then retaliating and cutting off trade with North Korea completely?
I think that we have to put everything into play right now because, Charles, I think that the Kim regime has made it very clear they are not going to be dissuaded from continuing to pursue until they have full capability to drop an ICBM with a nuclear warhead onto American cities. And I think we're probably a year or two away from that, of them having the re-entry technology necessary to do that. So I think everything has to be on the table, whether it is all of these economic sanctions against China and against, quite frankly, anybody that does business with North Korea, or we're faced with kinetic warfare on the Korean Peninsula, or even worse, American cities under attack from North Korean missiles.
Harry, a lot of folks who watch this, a lot of analysts who watch this, I've seen them say that these actions by Kim are actually rational, that the difference between him and other bad actors who have lost more recently is that he has a nuke. You know, it's a lot different than, remember the old scenes of Noriega with a machete in his hand, like, hey, I dare America to come get me. And then, of course, he's running through the jungles of Nicaragua like a week later, you know, praying to the voodoo doctor. You know, this is a guy who's at the podium pounding a nuclear warhead. Come get me, come get me. It changes the dynamics of everything.
Well, Charles, I was actually in that camp until really the last 24 hours. Why he wanted nuclear weapons was rational. I mean, you're not going to defeat a United States military that spends $600 billion a year when your economy is only worth $14 billion. There's no way. But for him to actually dare the international community that he's going to test a nuclear weapon in the Pacific Ocean is ludicrous. Because think about what can happen. Imagine if he fires that missile, it goes over Japan and its guidance systems fails or engines fail,
right,
and it crashes into Tokyo or a populated area. We're talking millions of people could die. That is irrational.
So, Rebecca, again, let's reset this and walk through the possible scenarios, because each time the stakes have gotten higher, each time they've done something, whether it's a more powerful nuclear device, whether it's a longer range missile capability, they've done something to snub President Trump and to become a greater threat to the world. What happens next?
Okay, first of all, our military, they're expecting this. They're ready to fight tonight. Second, if he does launch a missile out over the Pacific with an ICBM, with a nuclear warhead or not, here, it's real simple. It flies, it dies. That is what Harry Harris at PACOM says. We have the interceptors. We have that layered missile defense that's ready to go. So he does not really have a choice to do a launch like that. That opens up North Korea to any type of international action, a limited military response, anything. So he launches something, it flies, it dies. He is in huge trouble. It's the end of his regime.
Rebecca, everything you've talked about are defensive measures. Anything potentially on the offensive measures, anything to catch him off guard? Do we continue to counterpunch? Because at some point it will result in casualties.
Yeah, great question. So Mattis and McMaster are being real quiet on the details, but look at their faces. There's no question there are some offensive military options here that are ready to go if we decide with the UN and with our allies that that's what we need to do. And we'll set it up on our terms, not on Rocket Man's.
Ned?
Charles, the last thing the thing I wanted to say was, are we going to let this continuing existential threat continue? Or are we going to say enough is enough? And really, honestly, this is the failure of the previous 3 administrations to let it get to this point. And now Donald Trump is having to say, we are not going to let this get to its ultimate conclusion, which I fear is a very short runway left. We have to deal with it now. And so, again, it goes back to my earlier point. We have to use every means possible short of war to say we want to avert this. And we're not going to stop. And I think that's the thing that Donald Trump made very clear at his UN speech. He had a very clear-eyed, realistic view of not only what's going on with North Korea, but also Iran as well, and say, there's a new sheriff in town. We're not going to continue to let this linger on. My duty is to protect the American people at all costs, and I will, and by all means necessary.
I want to touch on Iran as well, because more provocation out of them as well post-UN speech. But I want to ask all of you guys then, if it doesn't get to a military conclusion, what would North Korea, what would Kim Jong-un, Harry, what would he want? Outside of course, a unified Korea with him at the helm, which is obviously not going to happen. What do? Could we sign one of those phony treaties with him and give him $30 billion or, something to that effect?
Charles, I don't think we can do that, because we have to remember the whole world is watching when these take these actions. I mean, you just mentioned Iran. Do you think the Iranians for 1 second aren't going to look at that and say, wow, when the Iran nuclear deal ends in 10 to 12 years, maybe we can get a deal like that? Or maybe they're going to come to the conclusion and say, look, the United States didn't stop the North Koreans from building nuclear weapons and ICBMs, so maybe we can continue on. Maybe we'll get sanctioned again, but we'll be able to develop the ultimate weapon that, if the United States ever wanted to impose regime change, that they wouldn't be able to stop us. So we have to watch these things very carefully, and I don't think we can give the North Koreans any more billions of dollars. I think it's a complete waste of time.
Rebecca, are you concerned about how quiet Russia has been throughout all of this? Even during the UN gathering, since then, it feels like they've got a greater role in this than anyone's talking about, all the focus being on China.
Russia, I like that they're quiet. They are trying to hang in there with the UN Security Council, and I'm glad they're being quiet right now. They'll be part of the solution. I expect this to end in talks. Russia was part of the 6-party talks. I expect to see them at the table when we get around to negotiating eventually. But for now, they are doing their level best to help us out and be quiet.
What do you make of the Iranians unveiling a new missile? Longer capabilities, multiple warheads, Rebecca. They say it's within the boundaries of the Iranian nuclear deal. Others are suspect. They say, no, that's a sort of intolerable belligerence that we just can't accept Would that be cause?
Range missile. Now, here's the deal. We know that they can develop an intercontinental ballistic missile by 2020 if they want to, because of their successful space shot back in April of 2016. Why they bring this missile out now? It's just going to frighten Europe, turn the world a little more against them. We already have radars strung all over Eastern Europe to start to take some countermeasures against this threat. So they're clearly trying to influence the recertification of the deal, but it's a weird move on their part. And don't forget, they are messing with our forces over in Iraq and in Syria. We had to shoot down 2 Iranian-made drones back in June. So Trump has always said, too, they have to stop supporting terrorism. This missile does not help their cause at all.
All right, guys, thank you all very, very much. Now, I want to turn to Fox News correspondent Greg Paulcott, who joins us live from Seoul, South Korea. Well, tensions with Iran reaching new heights today. The regime's leader vowing to strengthen their military and missile capabilities in what seems to be a complete defiance of President Trump's condemnation of them during his UN address. Joining me now, DeRoy Murdoch, National Review contributing editor and Fox News contributor, and Rebecca Grant is back with us as well. Guys, the Washington Post just now out with a piece saying, if Trump kills the Iran deal, he may give the world another rocket man. That seems counterintuitive to me, DeRoy, but what the hell?
They already are rocket men. This won't be anything new. Look, the Iranians, in violation of several UN Security Council resolutions and other motions like that, have had, I believe it's something like 15 to 18 missile launches since the Iran nuclear deal went through. Obama, right before he left, gave him a lovely gift, which is a plane load of, think about $2 or $3 billion in cash in dollars, euros, and I think Swiss francs. And you'd think after all that they'd behave themselves, and yet they're still attacking our ships.
But why behave yourself if you don't behave yourself and you're rewarded for it?
Yeah, why should they? And so I think this agreement, which they never even signed, by the way, their signature is not on the agreement. It's just a piece of paper. It's not binding. They've forbidden the international inspectors to go into their military sites. So this deal is laughable. It's like this little piece of paper. It's got about that much weight behind it. I think it's worthless, and I think we should get out of it. And there's just an open letter by 45 military experts saying that we should do exactly that.
You know, it's interesting because this week Nikki Haley did mention North Korea and Iran in the same statement. I want to play that for the audience.
We had so many bad deals with North Korea, and everybody looked the other way. And every time they broke that deal, the other way. Well, where are we now? They now have a hydrogen bomb. They now have ICBM. So if we don't do something and we make the same mistakes we made with North Korea, we will be dealing with Iran that has nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technology.
And yet, Rebecca, you've got the Washington Post, and remember, it is the Washington Post, though, coming out with this piece, which essentially is equating President Trump with Nikita Khrushchev, the famous scene when he banged the shoe in 1960, and Yasser Arafat when he wore a pistol to the UN. That's who they're comparing him to, saying if he takes action against Iran, he will actually make things worse. I don't even see the logic in that thinking.
That is such a tough one. So, here's the concern about the Iran nuclear deal. One, it has a shelf life. It's going to end anyway. So the concern is, will they go back to making nuclear weapons when the agreement ends? Or the other concern is, will they sneak off and do it covertly? They have about the same capability as North Korea did, maybe a little better, to turn that heavy water into a weaponized nuclear bomb if they need to. We know the agreement did not limit their missile tests. So the concern is kind of deal with it now or deal with it later. What a tough choice.
Yeah, but DeRoy, there are elements of the deal that allow, listen, the president's got to certify it every 90 days with Congress. We heard Macron make some positive comments with respect to perhaps taking a second look at this. So there are certain ways that they perhaps you can argue they've already violated the deal.
Oh, I think they have. I think they've violated it specifically, again, with the missile tests, if not the deal itself, certainly the UN resolutions which were supposed to prevent that. And again, their general behavior, continuing to support terrorism. You remember just before the money went through, you'd think they would have behaved up until then. You had U.S. soldiers on their hands and knees, their hands behind their heads, who were brought in by the Iranian military and held hostage for, I think, 48, 72 hours. Right. behavior is that? And what sort of a sense of goodwill does that show? The answer is zero. This is a belligerent country, one of the biggest supporters of international terrorism, in fact, the #1 supporter of international radical Islamic terrorism, and I think we have no business being in a deal that was a fiasco from day one.
And by the way, last night they reiterated that they would continue to support those same terrorist organizations, so that's
Absolutely.
To your point.
This does not improve their behavior in terms of missiles or anything else.
All right, guys, thank you all very much. President